12 years ago, my brother Marcus looked me dead in the eye and said I'd never lead anyone because I couldn't even lead myself out of a paper bag. Those words carved themselves so deep into my bones that even now, sitting in this debriefing room with commendations scattered across the table, I can still feel them burning. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment when those same words would echo through a warehouse where 200 innocent lives hung in the balance, and I had to choose between proving him wrong or watching them all die. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Memphis sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of the police academy training ground. Sweat stung my eyes as I army crawled under the razor wire, my elbows scraping against the rough concrete beneath. Behind me, I could hear the heavy breathing of my fellow recruits, some already falling behind in the grueling obstacle course that would determine who made it to the next phase of tactical training. My name is Elena Vasquez, and at 26, I was already older than most of the fresh-faced recruits around me. While they'd come straight from college or the military, I'd taken the long road here. 3 years as a security guard at downtown office buildings, 2 years working private protection for wealthy families who treated me like furniture, and countless nights studying hostage negotiation techniques in my cramped studio apartment above a laundromat. The instructors called my age a disadvantage. My family called it desperation, but I knew it was preparation. The obstacle course was designed to break people. 30-foot rope climbs, wall scaling, precision shooting under pressure, and tactical decision-making scenarios that could make or break a career before it even started. I'd been training for this moment for years, running 10 miles every morning before my security shift, practicing at the gun range until my fingers cramped, studying psychological profiles of hostage takers until the words blurred together on the page. As I holed myself over the final wall, muscles screaming in protest, I caught sight of a familiar figure standing near the chain-link fence that separated the academy from the parking lot. My stomach dropped like a stone thrown into deep water. Marcus. My older brother stood there in his perfectly pressed business suit, arms crossed, watching me with that same expression he'd worn 12 years ago when he'd delivered his verdict on my future. The expression that said I was still the screwed-up little sister who couldn't get her life together no matter how hard I tried. I forced myself to focus on the finish line, pumping my legs harder, ignoring the burn in my lungs. The timer showed I'd completed the course in the top 5%, but all I could see was Marcus shaking his head as he turned and walked back to his black BMW. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at my phone. 3 missed calls from Marcus, but I couldn't bring myself to listen to the voicemails. Instead, I pulled out a small wooden box from under my bed, the one thing I'd managed to keep from our childhood home before everything fell apart. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a faded Polaroid of Marcus and me at ages 8 and 6. We were wearing matching Halloween costumes, both dressed as police officers, grinning at the camera with gap-toothed smiles. On the back, in my mother's careful handwriting, were the words, "Future Crime Fighters, 1995. Beneath the photo was a crumpled piece of paper, a letter I'd never sent. It was my acceptance into the FBI Academy from 3 years ago, the opportunity I'd turned down because Marcus had convinced me I wasn't ready, that I'd embarrassed myself in our family name. He'd been so certain, so convincing in his arguments about my instability, my poor judgment, my inability to handle real responsibility. The memory of that conversation still made my chest tight with rage and regret. Marcus had been the golden child, the one who'd gone to law school, married his college sweetheart, and built a successful practice representing corporate clients. He owned a house in the suburbs, drove luxury cars, and sent our parents on expensive vacations. Meanwhile, I'd been bouncing between jobs, living paycheck to paycheck, trying to find my place in a world that seemed determined to prove Marcus right about my limitations. But that was before I'd discovered hostage negotiation. It started by accident. I'd been working security at a downtown high-rise when a man having a psychotic break barricaded himself in one of the offices, threatening to hurt himself and anyone who tried to approach. The police tactical team was 20 minutes out, and the man was escalating rapidly. Without thinking, I'd started talking to him through the door, using techniques I'd read about in psychology textbooks I'd checked out from the library. For 45 minutes, I talked to James Morrison, a recently divorced accountant who'd lost his custody of his kids and felt like his world was crumbling. I listened to his pain, validated his feelings, helped him see alternatives to the desperate act he was contemplating. When the tactical team finally arrived, he opened the door peacefully and allowed himself to be taken for psychiatric evaluation. The lead negotiator, Detective Sarah Chen, had pulled me aside afterward. She told me I had a natural gift for connecting with people in crisis, for seeing past their desperation to the human being underneath. She'd given me her card and suggested I consider a career in law enforcement. That was the moment I knew I'd found my calling. The police academy was just the beginning. My real goal was the FBI's crisis negotiation team, the elite unit that handled the most dangerous hostage situations in the country. It was a long shot, but for the first time in my life, I had a clear vision of where I wanted to be. The training was brutal. Physical fitness tests that pushed my body to the breaking point. Psychological evaluations that dug into every corner of my mind. Tactical scenarios that required split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance. But I thrived under the pressure in a way that surprised everyone, including myself. My instructors began to take notice. Captain Rodriguez, a grizzled veteran with 30 years of experience, started using my performance and scenarios as examples for other recruits. Agent Williams from the FBI Liaison Office attended one of my negotiation simulations and afterward asked for my contact information. But the voice in my head never stopped whispering Marcus's words. "You'll never lead anyone because you can't even lead yourself out of a paper bag." 6 months into the program, I received an invitation that made my hands shake as I held the cream-colored cardstock. Marcus was getting promoted to senior partner at his law firm, and the family was throwing him a celebration dinner at the country club. My name was printed in elegant script on the invitation, but I could practically hear the reluctance in my mother's voice when she insisted I be included. I almost didn't go. The thought of facing Marcus, of having to smile and congratulate him while he basked in yet another achievement, made me physically nauseous. But Detective Chen had taught me that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was action in spite of fear. The country club was exactly what I had expected. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, waiters in bow ties serving wine that cost more than my monthly rent. I felt out of place in my discount department store dress, surrounded by Marcus's colleagues and their perfectly polished wives. Marcus held court at the head table, regaling his audience with stories of his latest legal victories. He was in his element, confident and charismatic, everything I'd never been able to be. When he spotted me across the room, his smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered, raising his glass in my direction with exaggerated enthusiasm. "My little sister Elena, everyone! Still playing cops and robbers, I see." The laughter that followed felt like needles under my skin. I forced myself to smile and nod, accepting the condescending pats on the shoulder from family friends who asked when I was going to get a real job like Marcus. During dinner, the conversation turned to a recent hostage situation that had made national news. A group of extremists had taken control of a government building in Washington, D.C., and the FBI's negotiation team had successfully resolved the crisis without casualties. "It's all just psychology," Marcus declared, cutting into his steak with theatrical precision. "Anyone with basic people skills could do it. The real skill is in the legal framework that follows, making sure these criminals face appropriate consequences." One of his colleagues nodded sagely. "The negotiators are just there to buy time for the real professionals to work." I felt my jaw clench. These people had no idea what went into those tense hours, the mental chess game between negotiator and subject, the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. But I knew better than to argue. In this room, my opinion carried no weight. Later, as the evening wound down, Marcus cornered me near the coat check. He'd had several glasses of wine, and his usual polished demeanor had slipped slightly. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." His voice carried that familiar tone of barely concealed condescension. "When are you going to stop this phase and get serious about your future? You're almost 30. Don't you think it's time to grow up?" The words hit me like a physical blow. "This isn't a phase, Marcus. This is my career." He laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Career?"
Elena, you're playing pretend. This whole thing with the police academy, the FBI dreams, it's just another way for you to avoid real responsibility. Just like when you dropped out of college, just like when you quit that marketing job, just like every other time you've run away when things got difficult. I didn't run away. I found what I meant to do. What you're meant to do is fail, apparently. Look at your track record. You can't stick with anything long enough to succeed, and now you want to be responsible for other people's lives? It's delusional. The room felt like it was spinning. Around us, the party continued, but all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. You don't know what you're talking about. I know you, Elena. I've watched you your entire life. You don't have what it takes to lead anyone because you can't even lead yourself out of a paper bag. The FBI, they'll see right through you, just like everyone else does. I wanted to scream, to throw his words back at him, to tell him about the lives I'd already helped save, the progress I was making, the respect I was earning from people who actually understood what I did. But the weight of years of conditioning, of being told I wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't smart enough, pressed down on me like a physical force. Instead, I grabbed my coat and walked out into the night, leaving Marcus standing there with his smug satisfaction intact. That night, I sat in my car in the empty parking lot and cried harder than I had since I was a child. All the progress I'd made, all the confidence I'd built felt like it was crumbling under the weight of his certainty. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was deluding myself. Maybe I was just another failed project destined to wash out of the program and end up back where I started. But as I sat there in the darkness, I thought about James Morrison, the man I'd talked down from that office ledge 3 years ago. I thought about the letter I'd received from him 6 months later, thanking me for saving his life, telling me about the therapy he'd started, the relationship he was rebuilding with his children. I thought about the domestic violence victim I'd helped evacuate from her apartment building during my security job, and the lost child I'd reunited with his parents at the mall where I'd worked weekends. These weren't grand gestures or headline-making rescues. They were quiet moments when someone needed help, and I'd been there to provide it. They were proof that maybe, just maybe, Marcus was wrong. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Detective Chen's number. It was past midnight, but she'd told me to call any time if I needed guidance. Elena, what's wrong? Her voice was alert despite the late hour, and I could hear the sound of paper shuffling in the background. Detective Chen never really stopped working. I'm having doubts, I admitted, the words coming out in a rush, about whether I'm cut out for this, whether I'm strong enough. There was a pause, and I could picture her leaning back in her chair, choosing her words carefully.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Tell me what happened. I found myself spilling everything. The dinner, Marcus's words, the crushing weight of self-doubt that threatened to pull me under. Chen listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of understanding. Elena, she said when I finally finished, in my 20 years of doing this job, I've learned one thing above all else. The people who question whether they're strong enough usually are. It's the ones who never doubt themselves that you have to worry about. But what if he's right? What if I really can't handle the responsibility? Then you'll fail, and you'll learn from it, and you'll get better. That's how this works. But you know what the alternative is? You quit now, and you spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. You let someone else's fear of your potential determine your future. Her words settled into my chest like a warm weight. Someone else's fear of my potential? Elena, has it ever occurred to you that your brother might be threatened by your success? That maybe his need to diminish your achievements has more to do with his own insecurities than with your actual capabilities? I'd never considered that possibility. Marcus had always seemed so confident, so sure of himself and his place in the world. But thinking back to his reaction when I'd first told him about my acceptance to the police academy, I remembered something I'd missed at the time. For just a moment, before the condescension kicked in,
There had been something that looked almost like fear in his eyes. "I need to see this through," I said finally. Not to prove anything to him, but to prove something to myself. "That's the right reason," Chen agreed. "And Elena, when you do succeed, because you will, remember this moment. Remember what it felt like to doubt yourself, and use that to help others who are struggling with the same fears." I hung up the phone feeling lighter than I had in months. Marcus's words still stung, but they no longer felt like absolute truth. They were just one person's opinion, colored by his own biases and limitations. The next morning, I threw myself back into training with renewed determination. I pushed harder in physical fitness tests, stayed late to practice tactical scenarios, and volunteered for every additional training opportunity available. My instructors noticed the change, commenting on my increased focus and intensity. Captain Rodriguez pulled me aside after a particularly challenging hostage simulation. "Whatever happened to you this week, bottle it up and save it for when you really need it. That was some of the best negotiation work I've seen from a recruit." The simulation had involved a disgruntled employee holding his former coworkers hostage in an office building. The scenario was designed to test our ability to build rapport with subjects who felt betrayed by institutions they'd once trusted. I'd managed to establish a connection with the role player that allowed me to gradually de-escalate his anger and convince him to release the hostages unharmed. What struck me most was how natural it had felt. While other recruits struggled with the emotional demands of the exercise, I found myself genuinely caring about the subject's pain, truly wanting to help him find a way out of his desperate situation that didn't involve violence. "You have something special, Vasquez," Rodriguez continued. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." As graduation from the academy approached, I received news that changed everything. Agent Williams from the FBI had been tracking my progress, and based on my performance and training, I was being fast-tracked for consideration with the crisis negotiation team. It was an almost unprecedented opportunity for someone with my limited experience, but my combination of natural ability and intensive preparation had caught their attention. The interview process was grueling. Panel sessions with senior agents, psychological evaluations, background checks that dug into every aspect of my life. But I felt ready in a way I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about proving Marcus wrong anymore. This was about stepping into the role I was meant to play. 3 weeks later, I received the call. I'd been accepted into the FBI's Crisis Negotiation Training Program, a 6-month intensive course that would prepare me for deployment with regional crisis teams across the country. My first instinct was to call Marcus, to share the news with someone who would understand the significance of what I had achieved. But when I picked up the phone, I realized I didn't need his validation anymore. This victory belonged to me alone. Instead, I called my parents. My mother cried when I told her about the FBI position, and I could hear the pride in her voice for the first time in years. My father, a man of few words, simply said, "I always knew you had it in you, mija." "Does Marcus know?" I asked. There was a pause. "We'll tell him when you're ready to tell him yourself." I wasn't ready yet. I needed to prove myself in the field first, to build a track record of success that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. I needed to become the person I knew I could be, not just in training scenarios, but in real-world situations where lives truly hung in the balance. The FBI training facility in Quantico was unlike anything I'd experienced. The other candidates came from diverse backgrounds: former military, experienced law enforcement, psychologists, social workers. What united us was a shared commitment to preventing violence through communication and understanding. Our instructor was Agent Patricia Morse, a legend in the field who had successfully negotiated the release of hundreds of hostages during her 25-year career. She was tough but fair, pushing us to our limits while providing the support we needed to grow.
Negotiation isn't about winning, she told us during our first week. It's about finding solutions that allow everyone to survive and move forward. Your ego, your need to be right, your desire for glory, all of that has to be left at the door. The only thing that matters is bringing everyone home safely. The training was intense and multifaceted. We studied psychology, learning to recognize signs of mental illness, drug use, and emotional distress. We practiced active listening techniques, learning to hear not just the words people spoke, but the emotions and needs underlying them. We role-played countless scenarios, from domestic disputes to international terrorism incidents. But the most valuable part of the training was working with actual former subjects, people who had been involved in real hostage situations and were willing to share their experiences. Hearing their perspectives, understanding what had motivated their actions and what had ultimately convinced them to surrender peacefully, provided insights that no textbook could match. One former subject, a veteran named Danny who had barricaded himself in his apartment with weapons after a PTSD episode, became particularly influential in my development as a negotiator. "The thing is," he told our class, "when you're in that dark place, when everything feels hopeless, you don't really want to hurt anyone. You just want the pain to stop." The negotiator who reached me understood that. She didn't try to fix me or judge me. She just sat with me in that pain until I could see a way forward. His words resonated deeply with me. I thought about my own moments of despair, the times when Marcus's words had made me question everything about myself. I understood that feeling of being trapped by circumstances and emotions beyond your control. As we moved through the program, I found myself naturally gravitating toward the most challenging cases. While other candidates preferred straightforward scenarios with clear motivations and demands, I was drawn to the complex situations involving mental health crises, family disputes, and cases where the subjects felt abandoned or betrayed by society. Agent Morse noticed this pattern and began assigning me increasingly difficult training scenarios. During one exercise, I was tasked with negotiating the release of hostages held by a group of environmental extremists who had taken over a chemical plant. The scenario was designed to test our ability to handle subjects with deeply held ideological convictions, people who viewed violence as justified by their cause. The role players were FBI agents trained to portray realistic subjects, and they fully committed to their characters. For 6 hours, I worked to build rapport with the group's leader, a man who truly believed that the chemical plant was poisoning his community and that dramatic action was the only way to force change. I listened to his concerns, validated his feelings about environmental destruction, and gradually helped him see that holding innocent workers hostage wouldn't advance his cause. It was emotionally exhausting work, requiring me to maintain empathy for someone whose methods I couldn't condone while simultaneously protecting the lives of the people he was threatening. When the exercise ended with all hostages safely released and the subjects surrendering without violence, the debriefing room was silent for several long moments. "In 15 years of running this scenario," Agent Morse said finally, "that was the most natural, intuitive negotiation I've witnessed. You didn't just follow the techniques we've taught you. You internalized them and made them your own." The other candidates applauded, but I barely heard them. All I could think about was how right it had felt, how completely in my element I'd been during those intense hours of communication and connection. As graduation approached, we received our first assignments. I was being posted to Atlanta, where I would work with a regional crisis team covering the southeastern United States. It wasn't the most prestigious assignment. That would have been the elite hostage rescue team based at Quantico, but it was exactly what I needed. Real cases, experienced partners, and the opportunity to prove myself in the field. The night before I left for Atlanta, I finally called Marcus. He answered on the third ring, sounding distracted. "Elena? Is everything okay? It's late." "I wanted to let you know I'm moving to Atlanta. I got a position with the FBI." There was silence on the other end of the line. I could picture him processing this information, trying to reconcile it with his fixed image of me as his perpetually struggling younger sister. "The FBI," he said finally. "Doing what?" "Crisis negotiation. Hostage situations, barricaded subjects, that kind of thing." Another pause. That's great, Elena,"
I'm happy for you. But I could hear the doubt in his voice, the same skepticism he'd expressed at the country club. He was happy for me, but he didn't really believe it would last. He was waiting for me to fail, to come crawling back and admit he'd been right all along. Thanks, Marcus, I said simply. I should get some sleep. Early flight tomorrow. Elena, wait. His voice carried a note I didn't recognize. Be careful out there, okay? I know we don't always see eye to eye, but you're still my little sister. For a moment, I heard an echo of the brother who had dressed up as a police officer with me for Halloween, who had read me bedtime stories and taught me to ride a bike. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the familiar weight of his expectations for my failure. I'll be fine, Marcus. I know what I'm doing. Do you?
Because this isn't a game, Elena. People's lives are going to depend on you making the right decisions. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of responsibility? And there it was again, the same refrain that had haunted me for years, the assumption that I wasn't strong enough, smart enough, stable enough to handle real responsibility. I guess we'll find out, I said, and hung up the phone. That night, I packed my belongings into the same duffel bag I'd used throughout my training. As I folded my FBI credentials into my wallet, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. Every doubt, every setback, every moment of questioning whether I was strong enough had led to this opportunity. I pulled out the wooden box with the Polaroid and the unsent letter. Looking at that picture of Marcus and me as children, both dreaming of fighting crime and helping people, I felt a deep sadness for what we'd lost along the way. Somewhere in the process of growing up, Marcus had decided that success meant leaving others behind rather than lifting them up. He'd chosen competition over collaboration, judgment over understanding. But I didn't have to make the same choice. I could prove him wrong, not by diminishing his achievements, but by exceeding his expectations of my limitations. I could lead others, not because I was perfect, but because I understood what it felt like to doubt yourself and push forward anyway. The next morning, I boarded the plane to Atlanta with a sense of anticipation I'd never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I was moving towards something rather than away from something. I was stepping into my future as the person I was meant to become. As the plane lifted off and Memphis grew smaller beneath me, I made a silent promise to myself. I would prove Marcus wrong, but not for him. I would do it for every person who had ever been told they weren't good enough, smart enough, strong enough to achieve their dreams. I would do it for the hostages I would help rescue, the subjects I would help surrender peacefully, the families I would help reunite. Most importantly, I would do it for the 8-year-old girl in the Polaroid, the one who had dreamed of making a difference in the world before anyone told her it was impossible. The Atlanta field office buzzed with controlled chaos when I arrived for my first day. Agents moved purposefully through corridors lined with case files and surveillance photos, their voices carrying the crisp urgency of people who dealt with life-and-death situations as routine. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, but inside it hummed with the energy of federal law enforcement at work. Special Agent David Park, my new supervisor, met me in the lobby with a firm handshake and an appraising look. He was shorter than I'd expected, with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail about me in seconds. His reputation preceded him. 15 years with the crisis negotiation team, over 300 successful resolutions, and a teaching position at Quantico during his off-seasons. Vasquez, welcome to Atlanta. Hope you're ready to hit the ground running because we don't have time for a lengthy orientation period. The Southeast has been unusually active lately, and we're stretched thin. He led me through a maze of cubicles to a small office space that would serve as my desk. The walls were covered with maps of Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, each marked with colored pins indicating recent crisis incidents. Red pins for hostage situations, blue for barricaded subjects, yellow for domestic standoffs. There were more pins than I had expected. Your partner will be Agent Jennifer Costa, Park continued, gesturing toward a woman approaching from across the room. She's got 8 years of experience and has been asking for a new team member for months. Costa, meet your new partner, Elena Vasquez. Agent Costa was tall and athletic, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that held the kind of wariness that came from seeing too much human suffering. She extended her hand with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Fresh from Quantico,
she said, not unkindly, but with the tone of someone who had seen plenty of promising rookies burn out in their first year. What's your background before the Bureau? Police academy? Security work? Some informal crisis intervention experience? I replied, matching her directness. I know I have a lot to learn, but I'm here to work. Something in Costa's expression shifted slightly, a microscopic relaxation that suggested I'd pass some kind of initial test. Good, because we've got a situation brewing that might require both of us. Park pulled out a tablet and scrolled through what appeared to be incident reports. There's been chatter about a potential situation developing at the port of Savannah. Organized crime investigation that got some people spooked. Might be nothing, might be something big. Costa will fill you in on the details. As Park walked away, Costa gestured for me to follow her to a conference room where she spread out files and photographs across a large table. The images showed shipping containers, warehouse facilities, and surveillance photos of men in expensive suits meeting in parking lots. 3 months ago, the Drug Administration started tracking unusual shipping patterns through Savannah. Containers arriving from Eastern Europe with paperwork that doesn't quite match the contents. Nothing obviously illegal, but enough inconsistencies to raise flags. She pointed to a photograph of a heavy-set man with graying temples and expensive jewelry. Viktor Kozlov, Russian national with suspected ties to organized crime. He's been in Savannah for 6 weeks, ostensibly setting up legitimate import business. But his associates have criminal backgrounds, and his financial backing is questionable. What makes this a potential crisis negotiation situation? I asked, studying the surveillance photos. 2 days ago, DEA moved in for what was supposed to be a routine inspection of one of Kozlov's warehouses. What they found was concerning, not drugs, but evidence of human trafficking. Documents suggesting people were being moved through the port as cargo. The weight of that revelation settled in my stomach like a stone. Human trafficking was among the most heinous crimes we encountered, and traffickers were notoriously unpredictable when cornered. Costa continued. Yesterday, our sources indicated that Kozlov became aware of the investigation. He's moved his operation to a different warehouse, and we believe he may be planning to eliminate evidence.
The problem is, if our intelligence is correct, that evidence includes people. Hostages, I said quietly. Potentially 200 or more based on the shipping manifests we've recovered. Men, women, children from various Eastern European countries, all being held in container units while arrangements are made for their final destinations. The scope of the situation was staggering. 200 people trapped in shipping containers, treated as commodities by criminals who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses if they felt threatened. It was exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes scenario that had drawn me to crisis negotiation, but the reality of facing it so early in my career was intimidating. "What's our role in this?" I asked. DEA and local law enforcement are planning a coordinated response, but they want crisis negotiators on standby in case Kozlov decides to use the victims as human shields. Based on psychological profiling, there's a significant chance he'll try to negotiate his way out using the people in those containers as leverage. Costa showed me building schematics and aerial photographs of the warehouse complex where Kozlov had relocated his operation. It was a sprawling facility near the port, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. Multiple buildings, numerous potential exit points, and enough space to hide 200 people indefinitely. The challenge is that we don't know the exact layout of how he's organized the victims. Are they all in one location, spread across multiple containers? Are there guards? What's their psychological state after potentially weeks of captivity? These were the variables that made crisis negotiation as much art as science. Every situation was unique, requiring negotiators to adapt their approach based on constantly changing information and circumstances. Over the next 3 days, Costa and I immersed ourselves in preparation. We studied Kozlov's background, looking for psychological insights that might help us connect with him if negotiation became necessary. We reviewed case files of similar situations, analyzing what had worked and what had failed in previous trafficking standoffs. Kozlov emerged as a complex figure. Born in poverty in post-Soviet Russia, he'd built his criminal empire through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and strategic alliances. He had a reputation for being calculating rather than impulsive, which could work in our favor if negotiations became necessary. Calculating people could be reasoned with, shown alternatives that served their interests better than violence. But he also had a history of eliminating problems permanently. 3 suspected murders in Russia, 2 disappearances in Germany, and a pattern of leaving no witnesses behind when his operations were threatened. The key with someone like Kozlov is convincing him that cooperation serves his long-term interests better than resistance. Costa explained as we reviewed negotiation strategies. He's not ideologically motivated like a terrorist. He's not emotionally driven like a domestic abuser. He's a businessman who happens to traffic in human lives. So we appealed to his business instincts, I said, working through the logic. Show him that releasing the victims and negotiating a surrender gives him better odds of survival than a violent confrontation. Exactly. But we also have to be prepared for the possibility that he'll see the victims as his only leverage and be willing to harm them to maintain control. The thought of 200 innocent people suffering because of one man's greed made my chest tight with anger. But Costa had taught me that successful negotiators learn to channel that anger into focus rather than letting it cloud their judgment. On Thursday morning, everything changed. Costa and I were reviewing surveillance footage when Park burst into the conference room, his face grim. It's happening. DEA intercepted communications suggesting Kozlov is planning to move the victims tonight. They're moving in now and they want us on scene immediately. The drive to the warehouse complex took 45 minutes through Atlanta traffic, sirens clearing the way as Costa briefed me on what we might encounter. Remember, our job isn't to apprehend criminals or gather evidence. Our only priority is preventing loss of life. If Kozlov wants to talk, we talk. If he wants to make demands, we listen. Everything else is secondary. The staging area was a controlled chaos of federal agents, local police, DEA personnel, and tactical teams. Command vehicles lined the perimeter, the radio chatter creating a constant buzz of coordinated activity. In the distance, the warehouse complex looked deceptively quiet, but I could see the heat signatures on thermal imaging displays showing movement inside multiple buildings. Agent Sarah Martinez from DEA briefed us on the tactical situation. We've confirmed approximately 230 individuals being held in modified shipping containers in Building C. The containers have been fitted with basic ventilation and sanitation, but conditions are deplorable. She showed us real-time surveillance feeds from drones circling the complex. The images were grainy, but clear enough to see guards patrolling the perimeter and movement inside the main warehouse. Kozlov is definitely on site, along with an estimated 15 to 20 associates. They're armed, but we don't know the extent of their weaponry or their willingness to use violence. What triggered the move to immediate action? Costa asked. Intercepting phone calls suggesting they were planning to eliminate the victims tonight and disappear. We couldn't wait for a more favorable tactical situation. The weight of that information settled over the staging area like a heavy blanket. 230 people were going to die unless we could prevent it. The urgency was palpable, but everyone maintained their professional focus. Park pulled Costa and I aside. Tactical teams are preparing for entry, but there's a complication. The building layout makes it almost impossible to secure all the victims simultaneously. If shooting starts, people are going to die.
What do you need from us? Costa asked. Be ready to make contact if the opportunity arises. If Kozlov decides he wants to talk, you'll be our primary negotiators. But don't expect ideal conditions. This isn't a controlled environment with established communication protocols. As tactical teams moved into position, Costa and I set up our communication equipment in the command vehicle. Multiple radio frequencies, recording devices, translation support in case language barriers became an issue. The technology was sophisticated, but the success of any negotiation ultimately depended on human connection and understanding. At 3:47 p.m., everything went wrong. The tactical teams had achieved positions around the warehouse complex when one of Kozlov's guards spotted movement and opened fire. Within seconds, gunshots erupted from multiple locations as the carefully planned operation dissolved into a firefight. Over the radio, we could hear team leaders calling out positions, requesting backup, reporting casualties. The controlled precision of the initial approach had shattered into the chaos of armed combat. Negotiation teams stand by, Park's voice crackled through our headsets, suspect may attempt communication. Costa and I sat tensely in the command vehicle, monitoring radio traffic and watching surveillance feeds that showed muzzle flashes and tactical teams maneuvering around the warehouse buildings. The sound of automatic weapons fire was constant, punctuated by shouted commands and the crash of breaching charges. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the shooting stopped. All units hold your positions, came the order from the tactical commander. Suspect is attempting to communicate. A voice emerged from the warehouse complex, amplified by some kind of loudspeaker system. Heavily accented English carrying across the industrial landscape with chilling clarity. Federal agents,
You have made a very serious mistake. I have 200 people who will die if you do not withdraw immediately." Park's voice in our headsets was tense but controlled. "Negotiation team, you're up. Primary frequency is open." Costa looked at me, her expression serious but calm. "You ready for this?" I thought about Marcus's words, about all the doubt and dismissal I'd faced, about the long journey that had brought me to this moment. 230 innocent lives depended on what happened in the next few hours. This was exactly the kind of responsibility he'd said I could never handle. "I'm ready," I said, and meant it. Costa activated the communication system and spoke into the microphone with the steady professionalism of someone who had done this many times before. "This is Agent Costa with the FBI. We'd like to talk with you about resolving this situation peacefully." There was silence for several long moments. Then Kozlov's voice returned, tinged with suspicion, but engaged. "Agent Costa, you want to talk? Then perhaps you can explain why your people attacked my legitimate business operation. We want everyone to go home safely tonight. That includes you, your associates, and the people you're holding." "I am holding no one. These are employees, working voluntarily." The lie was blatant, but Costa didn't challenge it directly. Successful negotiation required allowing subjects to maintain face while gradually moving them toward better decisions. "I understand your position," she said calmly. "What we'd like to do is find a way for everyone to leave this situation safely. What would that look like from your perspective?" Another pause, longer this time. When Kozlov spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, more calculating, more engaged with the possibility of negotiation. "Your tactical teams withdraw to a distance of 1 mile. You provide transportation for myself and my associates to the airport. We leave the country, and your employees are released unharmed." Costa looked at me, raising her eyebrows slightly. It was a surprisingly reasonable opening position from someone in Kozlov's situation. Usually, initial demands were more extreme, requiring extensive negotiation to reach workable solutions. "That's something we can discuss," Costa replied, "but I need to know that the people inside are safe. Can you put someone on the line to confirm their condition?" "They are fine, but they will not remain fine if your people attempt to breach this facility." The implicit threat was clear, but Kozlov's willingness to engage in discussion was encouraging. People who were planning to harm hostages rarely spent time negotiating unless they saw genuine benefit in the process. For the next 2 hours, Costa maintained steady communication with Kozlov while federal agents worked behind the scenes to verify his demands and develop response options. The conversation followed the familiar rhythm of crisis negotiation. Gradual building of rapport, careful exploration of options, patient working towards solutions that addressed everyone's core needs. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the warehouse complex, intelligence reports brought disturbing news. Thermal imaging suggested that conditions inside the shipping containers were deteriorating rapidly. The ventilation systems were inadequate for the number of people being held, and medical emergencies were likely developing. Park pulled Costa aside during a lull in communications.
"We're running out of time. If those people don't get medical attention and proper ventilation soon, we're going to start losing them to heat exhaustion and dehydration." Costa nodded grimly and returned to the microphone. "Victor, we need to discuss the immediate welfare of the people inside those containers. Our medical team is concerned about their condition." "They are fine," Kozlov insisted, but there was something in his voice that suggested he knew otherwise. "I believe you want to keep them safe," Costa said carefully. "But shipping containers aren't designed for that many people, especially in this heat. Would you be willing to allow a medical team to provide assistance while we continue our discussion?" This was a crucial moment in the negotiation. Allowing medical personnel access would demonstrate good faith on Kozlov's part, but it would also provide intelligence about the exact situation inside the facility and potentially create opportunities for tactical intervention. The silence stretched for nearly 5 minutes. Then Kozlov's voice returned, but this time it carried undertones of stress and uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "I will consider this request.
But any deception, any attempt to use medical personnel as a cover for tactical action, and negotiations end immediately. Costa exchanged glances with me, and I could see the calculation in her eyes. This was progress, but progress that came with enormous risk. If the medical team's entry somehow triggered violence, we could lose not just the hostages, but also the medical personnel. "We understand," Costa replied. "We want to work with you in good faith. What would you need to see from us to feel comfortable allowing medical assistance for the people inside?" As negotiations continued into the evening, I found myself studying Kozlov's communication patterns, listening for psychological insights that might help us reach a resolution. He was clearly under enormous stress, but he remained rational and engaged with the process. That suggested he genuinely wanted to find a way out of the situation that didn't involve mass casualties. The challenge was that his demands, safe passage out of the country in exchange for releasing the hostages, were beyond what federal authorities could legitimately offer. Human traffickers couldn't simply be allowed to escape justice, no matter how many lives hung in the balance. But as Costa had taught me, successful negotiation often involved finding creative solutions that addressed everyone's core interests without necessarily giving them everything they initially demanded. As the night wore on, I began to see potential pathways forward. Kozlov's primary motivation appeared to be survival and escape from consequences. If we could show him alternatives that served those interests while also protecting the hostages, we might be able to reach a resolution. It was during this period of analysis and strategizing that I received a text message that momentarily shattered my focus. The sender was Marcus, and the message was brief but pointed. "Saw the news about Savannah. Hope you know what you're doing." The timing couldn't have been worse. Here I was, facing the most important challenge of my career, and Marcus chose this moment to remind me of his doubts about my capabilities. For a few seconds, his words echoed in my mind, undermining my confidence at exactly the moment when I needed it most. But then I looked around the command vehicle, at Costa calmly managing a life-and-death situation, at Park coordinating with tactical teams and federal agencies, at the dozens of professionals who were treating me as an equal partner in this critical operation. These people didn't see me as Marcus's incompetent little sister. They saw me as an FBI agent with training, skills, and responsibilities. I silenced my phone and refocused on the situation at hand. Whatever Marcus thought about my capabilities, 230 people needed me to be at my best right now. As midnight approached, the negotiation reached a critical juncture. Medical personnel had been allowed limited access to the containers, confirming that several hostages were in serious condition due to dehydration and heat exhaustion. Time was running out, and Kozlov's demands remained beyond what authorities could accept. That's when Costa made a decision that would change everything. She looked at me across the communication console and said, "I think it's time for a different voice. He's heard everything I have to say. Maybe a fresh perspective will help him see new possibilities." The responsibility of primary negotiator in a situation involving hundreds of lives was something I'd trained for, but never actually experienced. As I took control of the microphone, I thought about all the people who had believed in me: Detective Chen, Agent Morse, Captain Rodriguez, and all the training that had prepared me for this moment. "Victor, this is Agent Vasquez. I'd like to continue our conversation." There was a pause. Then Kozlov's voice, curious but cautious. "A new negotiator. Are you here to tell me the same things as Agent Costa?" "I'm here to listen and to help you find a way through this that keeps everyone alive." "Everyone alive," Kozlov repeated, and something in his tone suggested he was genuinely concerned about the welfare of the people in his custody. "Yes, that would be preferable." It was a small opening, but in crisis negotiation, small openings could lead to major breakthroughs. Over the next hour, I worked to understand not just Kozlov's demands, but his underlying fears and motivations. What emerged was a picture of a man who had gotten in deeper than he'd intended, who was facing consequences he hadn't anticipated, and who was looking for any way to protect himself and his associates from what seemed like inevitable destruction. "Victor," I said finally, "what if there was a way for you to demonstrate cooperation that might influence how authorities handle your case? What if showing good faith by ensuring these people's safety could be the beginning of a different outcome for you?" It wasn't a promise of immunity or escape, but it was the suggestion of hope, of possibilities beyond the stark choice between surrender and violent confrontation. For the first time in hours, Kozlov's response came quickly, without the long pauses that had characterized most of his communications. "Victor, you are suggesting that cooperation might lead to consideration?" "I'm suggesting that how this situation ends will absolutely influence how everything else proceeds. People remember when someone chose to save lives rather than endanger them."
As dawn approached, I could sense something shifting in the negotiation. Kozlov was moving away from his initial demands towards something more realistic, more achievable. But we still faced the fundamental challenge of how to safely extract 230 hostages from a fortified warehouse complex controlled by armed criminals. That's when everything changed again, in a way none of us had anticipated. The first explosion shook the command vehicle, followed immediately by the sound of automatic weapons fire from multiple directions. But this wasn't coming from inside the warehouse complex. It was coming from outside the perimeter. "All units, we have hostile contact from the north," crackled through the radio. "Unknown number of shooters, heavily armed." Through the surveillance feeds, we could see muzzle flashes from positions outside the established perimeter. A second group, apparently associated with Kozlov, but not inside the warehouse complex, had chosen this moment to launch an attack on the federal response team. The carefully controlled environment of the negotiation had suddenly become a chaotic battlefield with multiple hostile forces, federal agents caught in crossfire, and 230 hostages trapped in the middle of escalating violence. "Victor," I called into the microphone, "are you seeing what's happening out here?" His response came immediately, and for the first time, he sounded genuinely alarmed. "This was not planned. These people were supposed to wait for my signal. Can you contact them? Can you tell them to stop?" "I will try, but they may not listen. They believe you have come to kill everyone." The situation had moved beyond traditional negotiation parameters. We now had two groups of criminals, one inside the warehouse that we'd been successfully negotiating with, and another outside that was actively engaging federal agents in combat. The hostages were caught between all three forces, with no clear path to safety. Costa grabbed the radio to coordinate with tactical commanders, while I maintained communication with Kozlov. The professional calm of the previous hours had shattered into urgent, overlapping radio traffic and the constant background noise of gunfire. "Victor, those people inside the containers are going to die if this fighting continues," I said, abandoning subtle negotiation techniques in favor of direct appeal. "You said you didn't want anyone to get hurt. Help us protect them." What happened next would define not just my career, but my understanding of what it truly meant to lead in a crisis situation. Kozlov's voice came through the speakers with a clarity and determination that cut through all the chaos around us. "Agent Vasquez, I will open the containers and allow your people to evacuate the hostages. But you must stop this fighting. These people came here because they believed in me, and now they are dying for nothing." It was an offer of cooperation that could save hundreds of lives, but it required coordinating a hostage evacuation in the middle of an active firefight. The tactical complexity was staggering, and the potential for catastrophic failure was enormous. But it was also exactly the kind of impossible situation that crisis negotiators existed to resolve. Costa looked at me across the command vehicle, her expression serious but trusting. "Your call, Vasquez. You've got the rapport with him. How do we make this work?"
In that moment, with gunfire echoing across the warehouse complex and hundreds of lives hanging in the balance, I realized that everything I'd trained for, everything I dreamed of, everything Marcus had said I could never do had led to this single decision. I took a deep breath, keyed the microphone, and began coordinating the most complex hostage rescue operation of my career. The coordination required to evacuate 230 hostages during an active firefight pushed every system and protocol to its absolute limit. Within minutes, I found myself at the center of a complex operation involving federal agents, local SWAT teams, paramedics, and a Russian crime boss who had just become our unlikely ally in preventing a massacre. Kozlov's voice crackled through the radio with urgent intensity. Agent Vasquez, my people outside will not listen to radio calls. They believe this is a trap. You must give me physical proof that you are acting in good faith. The tactical commander's voice cut through the channel. Negative on any personnel approaching the warehouse. We've got active shooters on 3 sides and unknown explosive devices reported. I looked at Costa, who was coordinating medical teams for the anticipated influx of rescued hostages. The impossibility of the situation was staggering, but I could see a potential solution forming in the chaos. Victor, what if we demonstrate good faith by pulling back our tactical teams from the immediate perimeter? If your people see us creating space rather than advancing, would that convince them to cease fire? There was a pause punctuated by the sharp crack of rifle fire from somewhere beyond the warehouse complex. When Kozlov responded, his voice carried both hope and desperation. Perhaps, but they are scared, and scared men do not always think clearly. If I release the hostages and your people attack anyway, everyone dies. The weight of command settled on my shoulders like a physical force. Every decision carried life and death consequences for hundreds of people, and there was no time for lengthy consultation or careful analysis. This was exactly the kind of leadership responsibility Marcus had insisted I could never handle. But as I keyed the microphone again, I felt a clarity and confidence that surprised me. This wasn't about proving anything to my brother anymore. This was about saving lives, and I knew exactly what needed to happen. Victor, here's what we're going to do. I'm personally going to walk halfway between our positions, unarmed, where your people can see me. When they observe that we're not launching an assault, you begin releasing the hostages in small groups. As soon as the first group reaches safety, I'll signal our tactical teams to establish a clear evacuation corridor. The command vehicle fell silent. Costa stared at me with an expression that mixed admiration with concern. Park's voice came through my earpiece immediately.
Vasquez, that's not protocol. We can't risk a negotiator in an exposed position during active combat. But Kozlov's response came before I could reply to Park. This is acceptable. You show trust, I show trust. But Agent Vasquez, if this is deception, if your people use your position to attack, many people will die very quickly. Understood. Give me 10 minutes to coordinate with my team. The next few minutes blurred together in a frenzy of tactical planning and risk assessment. Medical teams positioned themselves for rapid triage of potentially injured hostages. Tactical units prepared to establish protective corridors while maintaining defensive positions against the external shooters. Communications personnel set up direct links between all units to ensure split-second coordination. Costa pulled me aside during the preparations, her expression serious but supportive. Elena, this is incredibly dangerous. If those external shooters decide you're a target, we might not be able to protect you in time. I know, but it's the only way to build enough trust for this to work. Kozlov needs to see that we're willing to take risks for those people's lives. And if Marcus could see you now? The question caught me off guard. I realized I hadn't thought about my brother's opinions or predictions during the entire crisis. The doubt and self-questioning that had plagued me for years had been completely absent, replaced by focused determination and clear thinking under pressure. He'd probably still find something to criticize, I said with a slight smile, but I'm not doing this for him anymore. At exactly 2:17 a.m., I walked out from behind the command vehicles and began moving across the open ground toward the warehouse complex.
The distance was only about 200 yards, but it felt like miles as I crossed the no man's land between federal positions and the building where Kozlov waited. The external gunfire had diminished, but not stopped entirely. I could hear the distinctive sounds of different weapons echoing off the industrial buildings around the complex. Every step forward increased my exposure to potential crossfire, but it also demonstrated to everyone watching that the federal response was focused on saving lives rather than winning a battle. Halfway to the warehouse, I stopped and activated my radio. "Victor, I'm in position. You can see me, and your associates outside can see me. I'm unarmed and exposed. This is our good faith gesture." "I see you, Agent Vasquez. You are either very brave or very foolish. Maybe both. Are you ready to start releasing the hostages?" "The first group is moving now. 20 people, mostly women and children who need immediate medical attention." Through my binoculars, I could see movement at the main warehouse entrance. A large shipping container door was rolling open, and figures began emerging into the harsh glare of portable floodlights that had been set up around the perimeter. The first hostages to appear were barely recognizable as human beings. Weeks or months of captivity had reduced them to skeletal figures, moving slowly and shielding their eyes against light they hadn't seen in too long. Some were being carried by others who were slightly stronger, creating a heartbreaking procession of suffering and survival. Medical teams, first group approaching the perimeter, estimated 20 individuals, several requiring immediate assistance. The external gunfire suddenly intensified, as if Kozlov's associates outside the perimeter had realized what was happening and were trying to prevent the hostage release. But the federal tactical teams had anticipated this, establishing overlapping fields of fire that forced the shooters to take cover rather than advancing on the evacuation route. "Victor, your people outside are increasing their fire. Can you communicate with them?" "I am trying, but they believe you are using this as cover for an assault. They will not listen to radio communication." This was the critical moment. If the external shooters decided to target the evacuation route or the hostages themselves, the entire operation would collapse into mass casualties and high fatalities. I needed to find a way to demonstrate that the federal response was genuinely focused on humanitarian rescue rather than tactical assault. "All tactical units, this is Vasquez. Establish protective positions around the evacuation route, but do not advance toward the warehouse or engage the external shooters unless directly fired upon. We need to maintain the appearance of purely defensive action." It was a calculated risk that required absolute discipline from every federal agent involved. They had to protect the hostages and medical personnel while maintaining the appearance of purely defensive actions that might be interpreted as aggressive by panicked criminals who were already shooting at anything that moved. The first group of hostages reached the medical staging area, and the reality of their condition became immediately apparent. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, untreated injuries, and psychological trauma that would require months or years of recovery. But they were alive and they were free. "Victor, first group is safe. Are you ready for the second release?" "Yes, but there is a problem. Some of the people cannot walk. They have been in the containers too long and they are very sick." This created a new tactical challenge. Hostages who couldn't walk would require stretchers and additional medical personnel, which meant more people exposed to potential gunfire during the evacuation process. How many people need medical assistance to evacuate?
Perhaps 30 or 40, maybe more. I made another command decision that pushed beyond established protocols. "Victor, we're going to send medical teams directly to the warehouse entrance to assist with the evacuation of injured hostages. This will require your people to hold fire and allow our personnel to approach. This is very dangerous for your people. It's necessary. Those people need immediate medical attention, and we can't leave them behind." The next phase of the operation required even closer coordination between teams that had been shooting at each other just hours earlier. Federal medical personnel approached the warehouse entrance under the protection of tactical units, while Kozlov's people inside maintained defensive positions and his associates outside continued sporadic gunfire at distant federal positions. As medical teams began carrying out hostages on stretchers, I maintained my exposed position in the middle of the compound, serving as a visible symbol of federal commitment to humanitarian rescue over tactical victory. It was exhausting and terrifying, but it was also the most important thing I'd ever done.
Agent Vasquez? Kozlov's voice carried a different tone now, less suspicious and more collaborative. Your people are doing exactly what you promised. I am beginning to believe this might end without everyone dying. That's the goal, Victor. How many more people are inside? Perhaps 150 still in the containers. Some are very afraid and do not want to leave because they think this is a trick. The psychological trauma of prolonged captivity had created another layer of complexity. Some hostages were so traumatized that they feared rescue attempts, believing they might be elaborate deceptions designed to harm them further. Would it help if some of the people who have already been rescued could speak to those still inside? Confirmation that this is real and that they're truly being taken to safety. Yes, this might work. Within minutes, we had established a communication link that allowed rescued hostages to speak directly to those still trapped in the containers. The conversations were heartbreaking and hopeful, frightened people reassuring other frightened people that freedom was real and rescue was genuine. As the evacuation continued through the pre-dawn hours, something unexpected began happening. The external gunfire gradually diminished and then stopped entirely. Kozlov's associates outside the perimeter had apparently observed the humanitarian nature of the operation and recognized that continued resistance served no purpose. Victor, it sounds like your people outside have ceased fire. Yes, I have been able to convince them that continued fighting will not help anyone. They are preparing to surrender to your people. By 4:30 a.m., the last of the hostages had been evacuated from the warehouse complex. 230 people who had been trapped in shipping containers, treated as cargo by human traffickers, were now receiving medical attention and beginning the long process of recovery and return to their families. Kozlov and his immediate associates surrendered peacefully, walking out of the warehouse with their hands raised as the sun began to rise over the port of Savannah. The man who had held hundreds of people captive had ultimately chosen cooperation over violence, influenced by a negotiation process that had emphasized shared humanity over adversarial confrontation. The debriefing process lasted for hours. Federal agencies conducted interviews, documented evidence, and began the complex process of identifying the rescued hostages and arranging for their repatriation to their home countries. The scope of the trafficking operation was staggering, involving criminal networks across multiple continents and potentially thousands of victims over several years. But for me, the most significant moment came when I was finally able to check my phone and found dozens of missed calls and messages. News of the hostage rescue had made national headlines, and my name was being mentioned as the lead negotiator who had prevented a potential massacre. Among the messages was one from Marcus, sent at 6:15 a.m. Saw the news. Call me when you can. I almost ignored it. The exhaustion from 18 hours of crisis management had left me emotionally and physically drained. The last thing I wanted was another conversation about my limitations and poor judgment. But something in the brevity of the message suggested a different tone than our previous interactions. When I called him back, Marcus answered immediately. Elena. His voice was strange, tentative in a way I'd never heard before. I've been watching the news coverage all morning. And 230 people. You saved 230 people. There was a long pause. I could hear background noise that suggested he was in his office, probably preparing for another day of corporate legal work that would seem utterly mundane compared to what I'd just experienced. The reporters are calling it one of the most successful hostage rescue operations in FBI history. They're saying your negotiation prevented what could have been a mass casualty event. It was a team effort, Marcus. I didn't do it alone. But you were the lead negotiator. You made the decisions that saved those people's lives. Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice carried something I'd never heard from him before. Genuine respect. Elena, I owe you an apology. A big one. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about your capabilities, your judgment, your ability to handle responsibility. I was wrong about everything. The words I'd waited years to hear felt surreal coming through the phone. But instead of the satisfaction I'd expected, I felt mostly sadness for all the time we'd lost to his misconceptions and my self-doubt. Why, Marcus?
Why were you so certain I would fail? Because I was scared, he said quietly. Scared that my little sister might be better at something important than I was. Scared that your willingness to take risks and help people made my safe, comfortable career look selfish and meaningless. I convinced myself you were reckless and irresponsible because it was easier than admitting you were brave and principled. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me, and it explained so much about our relationship over the years. His need to diminish my achievements hadn't been about protecting me or offering guidance. It had been about protecting his own self-image as the successful sibling. I'm proud of you, Elena. More proud than I've ever been of anything in my life. What you did last night, the way you led that operation, the lives you saved, it's extraordinary. After hanging up, I sat in the quiet of the debriefing room and thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. From the scared young woman who had been told she'd never lead anyone, to the FBI agent who had just coordinated the rescue of over 200 people, the transformation felt both gradual and sudden. Costa appeared in the doorway, looking as exhausted as I felt, but wearing a satisfied smile. Ready to head home? I think we've done enough work for 1 week. More than enough, I agreed, gathering my gear and the files that would need to be completed over the coming days. As we walked out of the command center, Costa put her hand on my shoulder. Elena, what you did in there was exceptional. The way you built rapport with Kozlov, the risks you took to demonstrate good faith, the coordination of that evacuation, that was master-level crisis negotiation. I had good training and a good partner. You had good instincts and better judgment. Don't minimize what you accomplished. Driving back to Atlanta as the sun climbed higher in the Georgia sky, I thought about the message I wanted to send to that 8-year-old girl in the Halloween police costume, the one who had dreamed of helping people before anyone told her it was impossible. I thought about Detective Chen, who had recognized potential in a security guard and encouraged her to pursue her calling. About Agent Morse, who had pushed me to excellence during training. About Costa, who had trusted me with the most important negotiation of my career. Most importantly, I thought about the 230 people who were alive because a team of dedicated professionals had refused to accept that their situation was hopeless. People who would return to their families, rebuild their lives, and have futures that had almost been stolen from them. Marcus had been wrong about my ability to lead, but more than that, he'd been wrong about what leadership actually meant. It wasn't about commanding others or proving superiority. It was about serving something larger than yourself, about making decisions that prioritized other people's welfare over your own comfort and safety. The hostage rescue operation would become a defining moment in my career, leading to recognition, advancement, and opportunities I'd never imagined. But the real victory wasn't professional success or family vindication. It was the knowledge that when hundreds of lives hung in the balance, I had found the strength and wisdom to help save them. 3 months later, I received an invitation to speak at the FBI Academy about crisis negotiation techniques. As I prepared my presentation for new recruits, I included a slide with a simple message. Leadership isn't about never doubting yourself. It's about acting with courage and compassion despite your doubts. In the audience that day were dozens of future agents, each carrying their own uncertainties and fears about whether they had what it took to succeed in federal law enforcement. Some would face family members who questioned their choices. Others would struggle with self-doubt and imposter syndrome. All of them would encounter moments when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. But they would also discover, as I had, that the most important qualifications for protecting others weren't superiority or fearlessness. They were empathy, determination, and the willingness to put other people's lives before your own comfort and safety. After my presentation, a young recruit approached me with a question that took me back to my own early doubts and struggles. Agent Vasquez, how do you know if you're really ready for this kind of responsibility? How do you know if you can handle it when lives are on the line? I smiled, thinking about a warehouse in Savannah and 230 people who had taught me the most important lesson of my career. You don't know until you're tested. But when that moment comes, you'll discover that being ready isn't about being perfect. It's about caring enough to do everything you can to help people go home safely. The recruit nodded thoughtfully and walked away, probably still carrying doubts, but perhaps also carrying hope that those doubts didn't have to define their future.
As I packed up my presentation materials, I thought about the phone call I'd received that morning from Marcus. He'd called to tell me that his law firm was partnering with an organization that provided legal services to human trafficking survivors, and he wanted my advice on how they could better serve that population. My brother was still the same successful attorney he'd always been, but he was using his skills for something that mattered beyond corporate profits. In helping me find my way to meaningful work, I had somehow helped him discover that his own talents could serve a higher purpose. The warehouse in Savannah had been demolished months earlier, replaced by a memorial garden dedicated to survivors of human trafficking. But the lessons learned there continued to resonate through every crisis I faced, every negotiation I conducted, every life I helped save. Marcus had been wrong when he said I'd never lead anyone, but in the end, being wrong had led him to something more valuable than being right. It had led him to recognize that true strength comes not from diminishing others, but from helping them discover what they're capable of achieving. And sometimes the people we save end up saving us in return. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.